to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Babin. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses for being here. And your testimony also served on transportation and infrastructure. And this very morning, we were talking about the emissions, the new emissions rule coming down in California. Mr. Baker, in your testimony, you mentioned that the California Air Resources Board acknowledged that their rule would potentially bankrupt the short line industry, and stated that it is possible that some of these businesses would be eliminated if they fail to comply with the rule. CARB sees the elimination of a critical player in the supply chain as a cost of doing business. Can you speak to the unique nature of short line business practices and why meeting CARB's mandate by 2035 is not feasible because of its potential crippling effects?
Yes, sir. I appreciate the question. The unique nature of short lines, which I know you're very familiar with from your time on the T&I committee, the origin story of short lines really is we're keeping lines viable that are really on the margins, right? We got them from Class 1 railroads in the first place because they didn't make any money. And we've done everything we can to run as lean, as efficiently as possible, try to get one more customer, try to do everything we can for existing customers. And it's widely considered a pretty good American success story that most agencies we've encountered would like to double down on and improve. But CARB's rule contemplates such a dramatic exponential increase in how much we would have to pay for locomotives and motive power that it would put us out of business. And that's so obvious that they had to acknowledge it themselves in the rule. And then, you know, from our point of view, the consequences of that are relatively obvious. But if we're out of business, that that freight can't move by rail anymore, and that destroys the seamless integrated rail network. That's bad for the economy, that's bad for the environment, it's bad for public safety.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Jeffries and Mr. Baker, you all touched on this in your testimonies, but if this misguided policy goes into effect, what will the impacts of this rule be on constituents outside of the state of California and on supply chains across the country?
Maybe I'll take a first crack and Chuck can clean up my mess. So, you know, there is no such thing as a one state regulation when it comes to the interstate rail network. That's why there's such strong federal preemption in law, because as I mentioned in my opening statement, nearly 70% of our locomotive fleet moves in and out of the state of California in any given year. And so what does that do? One, at the very base case scenario, this rule dramatically increases the cost of providing rail transportation and most likely shifts a lot of freight onto the highways. And so what does that do? It makes our customers pay more. It makes consumers pay more. It adds stress to the public infrastructure by pushing more trucks, more traffic onto the highways, increasing congestion, impacting the daily consumer. Mr. Obernolte and I just talked about the desire to get trucks off the highway and onto the rail. If you want to reduce emissions right now, let's get trucks off the highway onto the rail, 3 to 4 times more efficient when it comes to that. And so, you know, you can't understate the impacts across the board.
Right, thank you. Mr. Baker.
He said that very well. I would note that there is a long history, for better or for worse, of other states copying CARB's rules. So if this rule goes into effect, if EPA approves it, I think we could expect some number of other states, you know, maybe around 10 or 15 is a reasonable estimate, who would copy this rule and make it even more national. But I would say California is so big, and nobody would dispute that. California is so big, a California rule is essentially a de facto national rule as it affects the interstate rail network. So all the problems we've talked about that would come in California would be, you'd see nationwide very quickly.
Thank you very much. Less than half a minute. Mr. Baker, it seems like the California Air Resources Board is choosing winners and losers here. If they are able to move ahead with this rule, short line railroads look to be slated for the losers list. Can you talk about, just for a second, why short lines in particular are not going to be able to comply with CARB's compliance deadline and what it means for short lines around the country?
Appreciate that question. Going back again to the origin story of short lines and how we have to really make a small business try to run as efficiently as possible. A typical short line is buying a used locomotive, maybe about $100,000. They tend to make them last 40, 50, 60 years. The idea of a rule that would say no locomotive older than 23 years old can run in California is, if it weren't so serious, I would almost say it's laughable. But I mean, I say that to short line railroads and they look at me with disbelief, like, well, all of our locomotives are older than 23 years old.
Okay, thank you. Now, my time's up. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. We'll go next to my colleague from California, Congressman Mullen. You're recognized for 5 minutes, and nice job on the baseball field.